Over the last few weeks, I have been inundated with requests to make a video on the future of the left in a post-Bernie America. What do we do now? I assume that most of the people writing in this request want to know what I think about the Bernie or bust question. I have thoughts on that, and I will explore those at length. However, I plan to do something a little more ambitious. I would like to lay out something like a roadmap for the immediate, intermediate, and long-term future of the left, what you might call a leftist agenda. This template included a useful organizational slide as part of it, and I decided just to go with the template. Here are the three parts of the video I'm about to make. In the first section, we'll talk about the immediate future. I will give you my thoughts on what we should do in the 2020 election cycle. The second part will focus on the intermediate future, so after November of 2020, and especially focusing in on that period between the 2020 election and then the 2022 midterms and 2024 presidential elections. So that's what I consider to be the intermediate future. When I think about the long-term future, I'm talking about anything longer than the next 4 or so years. And the project that I ultimately want to build to is a takeover of the Democratic Party by the left. The key concept of my sort of vision here is an inside-outside game. This is by no means original, but hopefully this will kind of lay out a general roadmap which will be relatively feasible, I think, hopefully. Let's get into the fun and thorny issue of what to do in 2020 if you're a leftist and you're now presented with some rather terrible options. I know for sure that this section will definitely not earn any negative comments below. Here's what I think. Right now, there are a lot of people trying to come across as wise and really politically savvy who are saying that the reduction of harm argument ultimately dictates that we must vote for Joe Biden to protect the less fortunate, and that anyone who disagrees is simply privileged. Here's the problem. The reduction of harm argument does not apply here because of context. Anyone making this argument does not understand the context of living in 2020, and also does not understand the state of American politics. Allow me to explain. The reduction of harm argument goes that people who are vulnerable, i.e. women, minorities, gay people, etc., will be more harmed by Trump than by Biden. Therefore, we are all morally obligated to vote for the lesser of two evils. Here's the problem. I've actually looked and tried to figure out exactly where we can be guaranteed that Biden would actually protect anyone from anything. And it's shocking how little there is to choose between Biden and Trump. So the main thing that the reduction of harm people like to point out are Supreme Court seats. And in theory, the argument goes that if we eventually get a progressive president, we'll need friendly Supreme Court justices, or otherwise everything will be found unconstitutional. What they fail to realize is that if you actually look into the kinds of people who are being promoted to the court now, or at least who are being promoted to the court by Obama, while they are socially liberal, they are not anti-corporate. These are people who, one, believe in corporate personhood, and two, don't really have much of a fundamental problem with money and politics. These are the two problems that we most need to address, which would bring in the court. Also, when it comes to, say, passing sweeping healthcare legislation that the Republicans might try to challenge in court, once again, that deals with not how socially liberal a judge is, but how economically liberal the judge is. So, what would voting for Biden actually protect anyone from? Well, basically, again, it's limited to Supreme Court seats, and the only thing that Joe Biden would probably be forced to defend, against his own personal will, by the way, but forced to defend by the party nonetheless, would be abortion. So yes, if you are voting for Biden over Trump because of reduction of harm, you're literally voting on one issue, and that is abortion. Because that's the only thing where you can be guaranteed that Biden will be better than Trump. And even there's not all that much of a risk that Trump would go after abortion, because it would be damaging and it would help to mobilize the Democratic coalition against him. So, yeah. Also, consider for a moment, if you're still in the thrall of this god-awful reduction of harm argument, how exactly did black people and LGBTQ people make progress in the first place? Was it by the largesse of the Democratic Party? No, it was by their own efforts. The Democrats stepped in only when they built up enough of a movement and enough public support that it was politically advantageous to take up their cause. The LGBTQ community is still very mobilized, and I seriously doubt that the Trump administration will try to go after gay marriage. If they did, it would be extremely socially disruptive, and it would definitely lead to political backlash. The only danger from the Trump administration is if Trump has a Big Mac heart attack and then Mike Pence becomes president. So again, it's hard to see where the reduction of harm comes in. I mean, it's plausible, I guess, but it's really not that likely. And we also have to consider exactly how terrible Joe Biden is. That's something that you have to take into account. So let's talk about his commitment to social issues in general. You might think, well, okay, Biden sucks on everything economically, but on social issues, surely the Democratic base all agree on liberal positions when it comes to social issues. I might have even been willing to grant that point right up until the Tara Reade accusations. If you think about it, how quickly did Biden and his backers suddenly change their stance on Me Too? How quickly did they engage in mental gymnastics rather than standing up on principle? Do you honestly believe that the Democratic Party would stand on principle if, say, Biden had done something equivalent to supposedly raping someone on the issue of race? There would be mental gymnastics and would be told that it's actually not racist and not the same as Trump. If it were on gender, say on like the right of people to change genders, if Biden had done or said something horrible on that, there would be an equal amount of mental gymnastics to defend his conduct. Biden and the Democrats of his ilk have no fundamental commitments to any social issues. It's a hard lesson, but it's one that we all need to remember. They have no fundamental core convictions at all, period. Also, keep in mind, Biden most likely will lose, but even if he does win the election, it's very unlikely that a guy who is going to make god-awful cabinet picks, including Michael Bloomberg, of all people, will have a successful presidency if faced with any kind of pressure whatsoever. And guess what? The outbreak of COVID-19 means that a Biden presidency would be a challenging one. We also get no real say in who he picks as his VP. That is fundamentally undemocratic in nature. Effectively, the party apparatchiks are going to be imposing a president upon us by putting somebody on Biden's ticket who will most likely take over within a year or two's time. That is not a great precedent to set for democracy. It fundamentally silences the voices of all voters in the democratic process. And one last thing against this idiotic reduction of harm argument. We have already experienced 40 years of neoliberalism. The verdict is in. We know what we can expect. We know exactly what Biden will and won't do. We can try to delude ourselves into thinking that he'll be forced to be another FDR and he might get a little New Deal-y on us. That's not going to happen. There's no chance. Biden is very much set in his ways, and he has been a part of neoliberalism since before it became the dominant strand of the Democratic Party. He was one of the people who made it the dominant strand of the Democratic Party. Let's look at the accomplishments of the neoliberal era. Under Bill Clinton, we had deregulation and NAFTA. Big winners. Then under Obama, after Obamacare, we had sequesters and shutdowns. So yeah, fun times. What are the actual achievements of the neoliberal era? There are only really 3 pieces of legislation that have moved the ball forward in the last 40 years. And none of these are perfect, but here they are. The ADA, Americans with Disabilities Act, that was passed by H.W. Bush and a mostly Democratic Congress. That one is the only really major piece of legislation that actually advanced civil rights in this generation. Medicare Part D by Bush was a corporate giveaway, but it also helped seniors. And then there is the ACA or Obamacare, which, again, major corporate giveaway, but also did help people with health care to some extent, although it is extraordinarily flawed. Those have been the great achievements of the neoliberal era. 4 decades and only 3 pieces of legislation, 2 of which, as I mentioned, are extraordinarily flawed, despite the good that they do. So, yeah, great. You think Biden will protect the environment? No. You think Biden will move us to renewable energy? No. Election reform? No. Medicare for all? He'll veto it. There's no reduction of harm. I'm sorry. Let's dispel with that notion completely and immediately. It's completely idiotic to think that the world will be fundamentally better off replacing one old, past his prime, semi-coherent idiot with another when both of them hold the same right-wing views on a fundamental level. As for the option of not voting, I've heard a lot of people advocate this. This is certainly preferable to the reduction of harm argument, but it's still unproductive. The message that it sends is fundamentally unproductive because what it does is it gives the pundits a chance to say that people on the left are unreliable voters and therefore do not deserve their attention at all. So I don't think it's a great option. I understand the level of discontent people have, and I understand not wanting to participate in a process which is so deeply flawed. But I think we have to. As for the idea of voting for Trump, this is equally unproductive. I know a lot of people like the idea of the protest vote by voting for the other party to send a message. It doesn't actually do that. All it registers for is support for Trump. And he's the kind of guy who might take that as a mandate to do something shitty. So that's not a good idea. And we also don't want to reinforce this bullshit establishment narrative that Bernie people and Trump people are in any way meaningfully aligned, because that is not true. As for writing in Bernie, that's a pure protest vote. I'm not entirely opposed to this idea. It would show what we would have voted for, and it would also show exactly the votes that Biden is missing out on. So it's a decent option, but I think that there is one that is slightly better. And here I have to disagree strongly with Matt Christman of Chapo Trap House, who said that third parties are for cranks. Third parties can actually serve an important purpose if you're using them strategically. And they are an important facet of my inside-outside strategy. What we need to do is get together as a bloc, those of us who refuse to vote for Joe Biden, and we need to go vote for the same third-party candidate. Most likely it will have to be the Green Party nominee, since this is the only game in town, really, when it comes to a mass scale. DSA might be an option, maybe going forward after this election cycle, but for right now, we need to make sure that we focus in on someone who can get on the ballot in a decent number of states. The reasons for this are to show strength, so it has the same numerical effect as voting for Bernie by writing him in. It also helps to build up a party apparatus. And it shows clear defiance that is directed. So, voting for Bernie is simply saying fuck you, which is fine. But voting for a third party, like the Green Party, says fuck you to the Democrats while also helping us in the long run to overthrow the Democrats. What we need to keep doing always, and this begins right now, is to keep developing the organization of the left outside of and not beholden to the Democratic Party. Every organization that becomes suborned by one of the two parties immediately loses its reason for existing and any kind of effectiveness for the people it purports to help. The Human Rights Campaign, which did so much to advance LGBTQ rights, is basically just become a wing of the Democratic Party which endorses whichever establishment douchebag happens to be the choice of the elite. Even if that person does not have the best record on gay rights, and guess what? They never do. Why? What is that? Well, yeah, obviously. It's because if you get suborned by the party, you become a tool of the party and you become useless. If you look at the Republican Party, the NRA at one point actually served its constituents to some extent. Now it serves two constituencies. One, the gun lobby. Two, the Republican Party. Have you ever noticed that the NRA only endorses Republicans? No matter how pro-gun a Democrat might be, he or she will never, ever, ever, with one or two random exceptions here and there, receive the endorsement of the NRA or receive any credit at all for doing anything. It's even the Democrats who are pretty pro-gun are very hard-pressed to get more than a D from the NRA because it literally is just part of the Republican Party at this juncture. So, again, we do need to have a refuge outside of the party to use as a leverage point. By 2022, when the midterm elections are being held, I hope that there is already the basis of a strong inside-outside game. The inside game will be running people in Democratic primaries and trying to control the levers of the party. The outside game will be cultivating third parties and also cultivating outside movements which will serve as pressure groups on the Democrats and even on the Republicans to some extent by helping to influence public policy and public opinion. All great changes since the progressive movement have come when there's a strong outside movement which creates a sufficient level of pressure to force a political party, or sometimes both political parties in the progressive era, to enact its cause or causes as policy. If there is no outside pressure, politicians will not pick up the cause. And if they do, they will end up like Bernie Sanders was for most of his career, being a man on an island. If we look back at the New Deal era, it's very clear that the real backbone of that era and the strength that kept the New Dealers in power in their party and also in the country was the labor movement in America. We need to revitalize labor in this country. It is the right move forward in terms of policy, and politically it is the thing that the left needs in order to actually get anywhere. Only labor, which unites people based on their economic interest, one thing that people share across gender, racial, and other lines, is class interest. Most people work for a living. Most people are not financially secure. This is something which creates a unity that other issues cannot. This has to be the backbone and center of the left at all times, and we should never stray from that. Unions would be nice, and hopefully more unions will begin to pop up over time. There have also been talks about general strikes and things of that nature. I am 100,000,000% on board with that, and I do hope that those talks materialize into actual strikes. That is the best thing that can happen for us, and that is really the genesis of the labor movement that I am envisioning here. If we think about the Democrats honestly, they are a corporate anti-change party at the moment, and they have been for at least 30 and really more like 40 years. What we need to do, again, cultivate a viable third party, and by viable third party, I don't mean one that can win the presidency. I just mean one that's on the ballot in every state, which can be used as a go-to protest vote and can also occasionally win some seats. So, whenever the Democrats choose somebody shitty at a local, state, or federal level, a Biden, Buttigieg type, you can pick somebody else. You have a go-to move, which can hopefully also be productive. Ballot initiatives are also something that we need to think about a lot more. If we look at a lot of states which have passed legalized marijuana, it has come from ballot initiatives. As we've observed on many occasions, people's actual positions on policy are to the left of the labels that they ascribe to themselves. If you ask people if they support socialism, a lot of them say no. If you ask them about specific socialist policies, the response improves dramatically. Ballot initiatives are a great tool that the left needs to utilize more, and most of them are organized by outside groups with just a little bit of inside support. This is a major step forward, especially at the state level. So I said I wasn't going to talk about the 2020 primaries too much, but I might have to refer back to them a little bit here and there. One thing that Bernie sometimes did and sometimes didn't do was to make sure that his policy narratives were complete and identified bad guys. By complete, I mean including all of the details people want to hear. You need a moral case. A lot of people ask for how you pay for it, so when it's relevant, make sure you say it, or at least have some way to deal with the question. It was stunning to me that in all the debates he partook in, Bernie Sanders never once said that if you look at the total cost of Medicare for all over 10 years versus the cost of our current healthcare system, that really it's not nearly so expensive as Biden was making it out. Biden kept getting away with the lie that Bernie's plan was $35 trillion and his was $500 billion. And Bernie never called him out on that. I know that a lot of people don't like to talk about numbers, but sometimes you have to. It's also sometimes worth using things like modern monetary theory and pointing out that, yeah, sometimes there's a good argument to be made that things like debts and deficits don't actually matter that much. Even Dick Cheney said as much once. Also, point out how much money Trump spent bailing out Wall Street and how much money Bush and Obama spent bailing out first Wall Street and then the auto industry. Where did that money come from? How was that money? How did we afford that? Well, we didn't, but we did it anyway because people deemed it necessary. So maybe we should apply the same logic to other issues. Also, never forget to talk about military spending and how much of it is wasteful. And when it comes to identifying bad guys, name names. If they ask for specific examples, point out people and institutions and companies which are corrupt and which are the beneficiaries of bad public policy. Also, be sure to point out people who are victimized, but do it in a way where you have facts on your side and don't get overly emotional. Come across as cool, calm, and competent. One mistake I see people on the left making is trying to be too internationally conscious when dealing with others. Now, obviously being internationally conscious is a good thing, and we can learn a ton from studying the politics of other countries. I'm 100% on board with that. That's part of why I love watching Michael Brooks's channel, is because he talks a lot about the politics of Latin America and other places that tend to get a bit neglected. But when you're talking to people about why your policy is the best, whenever possible, use American examples, especially if these policies have been tried somewhere in America, or talk about studies done in America about how this would affect America. The reason is that there are still a number of people here who are obsessed with being American and are very skeptical of arguments that things that work other places could work here. Some of these people are swing voters who could be won in elections, despite this obsession with America. So that is a good place to go to get votes, and it really comes at a pretty low cost. Speaking along those lines of sort of how we should have a kind of discourse among ourselves versus one for the public, do not use jargon with random people. Don't use Marxist dialectic. People are not going to know what the fuck you're talking about. It will be a waste of your time and a waste of the time of the person you're talking to. Just be straightforward and say what you mean and get through the message. We need to massively de-emphasize identity politics. If 2020 cycle showed one thing, it's that identity politics has a very limited viability. If you look at all the candidates who relied on it heavily, starting with Gillibrand, Harris, Booker, and then Warren, after she initially succeeded not doing it, she then shifted to it, all of them fell flat on their faces. None of them got anywhere. Identity politics is not very effective. It also very much turns off people outside of the Democratic Party. It even turns off many people within the Democratic Party. It's not good politics. Focus on class. If in doubt, keep it classy. Class, again, is the only thing which unites people from all walks of life. Sure, you can't win over the rich, but we don't need them. They're not that numerically significant. We need votes. We need bodies. Most people are not rich. Most people have to work for a living. Most people are concerned about the cost of healthcare, the cost of housing, being able to afford raising a family, educational debts, access to job opportunities. These are all things that unite a broader swath of the public than any identity issue that the Democrats talk about. So, to the greatest extent possible, de-emphasize very specific, minute identity issues and focus on more universal issues. That is the path to building a winning coalition. Now we come to another issue that's thorny. Which label should we use? Democratic Socialist, Social Democrat, New Deal Democrat. Each of these has pros and cons. Democratic Socialist at this point at least has name recognition due to Bernie and due to DSA. However, there are people who like to quibble about the differences between Democratic Socialist and Social Democrat. In America, there's no meaningful difference. But again, this comes back to America versus international politics. If there's no difference among American voters, don't quibble over the verbiage. It makes no difference. This is an option. Even though it did fail this time, this term is becoming more and more accepted over time. So it is possible to stick with the label of Democratic Socialist. I think we might be a little better served to go with New Deal Democrat, although I do have some reservations about this as well. So the upside for New Deal Democrat is that, again, it's rooted in American history, and clearly the New Dealers were not communist. They waged the fucking Cold War, after all. But the downsides of the New Deal Democrats, one, even the boomers, for the most part, are too young to remember the New Deal Democrats in any kind of detail. Many of them are unaware of the fact that the Democrats of their youth were much different than the Democrats of today. The other thing is that there have already been misleading arguments which have been put forward since 2016 when people started to suggest that Bernie was sort of a New Dealer, saying that the New Dealers were fundamentally racist. And then they'd point out the social values of, say, organized labor back in the 50s, when most people were racist. So the argument's easy enough to refute. Each generation has its own social values, and those values largely die with that generation. And all of the old New Dealers of the greatest generation are basically dead at this point. So problem solved. Any kind of New Deal coalition would, of course, be composed of new people with current day political and social views. So it's an easy argument to win in theory, but in practice, the establishment would play the race card and play it very hard. So really, this is a question that I'm leaving open to the public. I don't really know which label is preferable, or if there is an alternative label to that, maybe just progressive. How staunch should we be about really defining terms? How much leeway should there be with these terms? It's hard to say. I will say I don't think the term liberal is a winner. I think we need to avoid that one completely. Progressive's an option. New Deal Democrat's an option. And Democratic Socialist, I think, is something of an option, although I don't think it's a very good one. Another thing to realize about messaging is that on the left, we're trying to appeal to workers. So one way to let them know that we're not friends and we're not in cahoots with their managers is to eliminate all, or at least as many as possible, of the PMC cliches from our vocabulary as possible. So basically what I'm telling you is that if what you might say would sound perfectly in place in a corporate boardroom or as a generic email from a university administrator just talking about condolences or concerns or things in the most broad sense, or using buzzwords, let it go. It's not politically viable. People don't want to hear professional class patter. They want to hear truth. They want to hear facts. They want you to be direct with them. They want you to be straight with them. They don't want bullshit. They want you to get to the point. They want you to be honest. So, tell it like it is, to use the old cliche. Another thing to keep in mind is that despite the fact that we do need to avoid jargon of all kinds, we are held to a higher standard both by random voters and by the media. If you ever have a political conversation with a relative who disagrees with you, you will be held to a much greater degree of scrutiny than your drunk Republican uncle at Thanksgiving or your traditional blue no matter who cousin or whoever. You always have to defend your positions in much greater detail than anyone else in the political system. Part of the reason why people spread the narrative that AOC was dumb is because the questions that she got as a candidate in 2018 were harder questions than the questions that other new candidates got. She was asked detailed foreign policy questions. A lot of the other people running for the first time were not really expected to know that much since they hadn't been in government. But most of them had a lot more leisure for the last, say, 10 years than she had. And most of them also had a previous background in politics, maybe at a state level, yet they were expected to not know as much. If you are on the left at all, people will expect you to know 2 to 3 times more than someone who holds any other view. So always keep that in mind. And accordingly, stay up to date with stuff and make sure that you know what the fuck you're talking about. The ultimate goal, of course, of all leftists right now is to oust the establishment and enact a progressive administration which will achieve policy goals which will improve the lives of the American people. How do we actually do that? Well, before I get into the steps, let me preface all of this by saying it's possible that this will be a very long, drawn-out, frustrating, and painful process. If we look by comparison at the rise of the New Democrats to prominence within the Democratic Party, i.e. the current establishment created by Bill Clinton, they only fully took over in 1992, even though that group formed within the Democratic Party in a fairly clear way by about 1978. And then it really was fully formed by the mid-80s. Yet it was only in 1992, after years of arguing every time something went bad for the Democrats it was time to run right, that this group of neoliberals finally took control. It may be the case that it will take us equally as long starting back in 2015 when the left really started to organize for real. So keep that in mind. It may not be the case that 2024 is a viable goal. Nonetheless, we have to keep forging ahead as best we can. Here's how we do it. Support progressive candidates in Democratic primaries whenever you can. If this means you have to remain registered as a Democrat despite the fact that you hate the party, that's a small price to pay. Ultimately, we will have to take over the Democratic Party in order to enact change. Most likely, the third parties that we cultivate, assuming we cultivate, say, the Green Party, it will only be good as a leverage mechanism. It probably will not end up displacing the Democrats. So keep that in mind. We need the inside-outside game. If someone is elected in the primary who you think sucks, say a Biden-Buttigieg type person, vote third party. No questions. Do this at every level. We need to cultivate as much talent as possible. We need to have people with experience on our side, people in offices of all descriptions. Right now, the establishment has another way to try to enforce corporate bullshit, and that is by cultivating a cadre of professional consultants who are now given job security by the fact that in order for a candidate to receive money from the DNC, the candidate has to select a campaign manager from this pre-approved list. We have to counter this by cultivating a cadre of left-only organizers and candidates. In order to make sure that they have some form of stability in their lives, we need to encourage them to be willing at any time to switch their allegiance between calling themselves Democrats and calling themselves Green Party, DSA, or whatever it might be. We need to avoid, again, being beholden in any meaningful way to the Democratic Party until it is our party. So this is vital because, again, the establishment is trying to freeze out left candidates by forcing left candidates to adopt neoliberal advisors who will then fuck them over. We have to counter that. We also need to make sure that any labor organizations currently existing or which will exist, and all future social movements need to learn from the lessons of, say, the groups which have been captured by the Democratic establishment, the Human Rights Campaign and others. We need to learn the lesson that if you are suborned by the party, you become a tool of corporatism. All of these new movements need to work with the Democratic Party without joining it. They need to be willing to say fuck you to the party if the party does not adhere to what they want to do. You need to know when to hold them, you need to know when to fold them. This is a fundamental lesson that we must all internalize. Another fundamentally important thing is that the presidency is only one piece of the puzzle. Sure, the office of the presidency is disproportionately powerful, but we need other stuff too. We need to focus on local, state, and legislative seats across the country, whether it's city council, state assembly, Congress, it doesn't matter. Run for and try to win literally anything possible. So, those are my thoughts. Of course, this is not a 100% complete plan. Maybe I got a few things wrong. I don't know. But this is what you asked for, so, be careful what you wish for if you don't like what I had to say. Until next time, I'm Thersites the Historian.